The lawyer's voice droned through the mahogany-paneled office like a wasp trapped in a jar, reading out the terms of Cornelius Blackwood's will with mechanical precision. But I wasn't listening anymore because I'd already seen the number next to my name, and it was exactly what I'd expected. Nothing. My older brother Percival sat across from me in his bespoke suit, trying and failing to hide the smirk that played at the corners of his mouth, while our sister Theodora dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, even though we all knew she hadn't shed a real tear since our father's funeral 3 days ago. The entire estate, the sprawling manor in Connecticut, the investment portfolio worth $47 million, the collection of rare books, the vacation home in the Hamptons, all of it was to be divided equally between Percival and Theodora. And I got a single sentence acknowledging my existence and a leather-bound copy of Moby Dick that our father had never even read. I stood up while the lawyer was still talking, cutting through his explanation of trust funds and tax implications with the scrape of my chair against the hardwood floor. And both my siblings looked up at me with expressions that ranged from surprise to something that might have been concern if either of them were capable of that emotion. "Congratulations," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I'd expected, almost cheerful, which seemed to unsettle them more than if I'd started screaming. I walked out of that office with my head high and that ridiculous book tucked under my arm. And I didn't look back, even though I could feel their eyes boring into my spine, probably wondering why I wasn't begging or crying or throwing the tantrum they'd been expecting for the past 30 years. The truth was that I'd known this was coming since I was 7 years old, and told our father I wanted to be a teacher instead of going into finance like Percival or marrying well like Theodora was being groomed to do. Cornelius Blackwood had looked at me across the dinner table with those cold gray eyes that I'd inherited, along with his stubborn chin and his tendency toward migraines. And he'd said very clearly that I was making a choice that would have consequences, that money followed ambition, and I was choosing to be poor. I'd nodded, not fully understanding what he meant, but understanding enough to know that I'd just been written out of some invisible ledger in his mind, relegated to the category of disappointments alongside his brother who'd become a poet and died penniless in Prague. Growing up in the Blackwood house meant growing up with the constant reminder that love was conditional and approval was currency. And I'd been broke in that economy since childhood. Percival learned early how to play the game, choosing Harvard business over his secret dream of studying marine biology. Dating women our father approved of even when I knew he was miserable. Taking a job at father's investment firm even though he'd once told me late at night that the thought of spending his life moving money around for rich people made him want to drive his car off a bridge. Theodora played it differently but just as effectively, becoming the perfect daughter who hosted charity luncheons and married Preston Ashford Kent III, a man with more family money than personality, producing 2 children in quick succession and decorating her life like one of the show homes in her interior design portfolio. I became a high school English teacher in the Bronx, married a social worker named Luna, who our father refused to meet because her parents were immigrants from the Philippines, and we lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment that cost more than it should have, but was filled with books and laughter, and the kind of love that didn't come with conditions attached. Every Thanksgiving and Christmas, I showed up to family dinners and endured the subtle digs about my charming little life and the not-so-subtle questions about when I was going to get a real job, and every time I left I promised myself it would be the last time, but somehow I kept coming back. Luna asked me once why I bothered, why I subjected myself to people who clearly didn't value me, and I told her it was because they were family. But the truth was more complicated. Some part of me kept hoping that one day my father would look at me and see something worth loving. That hope died the day I sat in that lawyer's office and realized that even in death, Cornelius Blackwood was sending me a message. The copy of Moby Dick wasn't random. It was the book I'd written my college thesis on. The one time my father had attended one of my academic presentations and sat in the back row with his arms crossed, leaving halfway through. I'd written about obsession and the cost of chasing something that would destroy you, about Captain Ahab's inability to let go of his revenge against the whale, even when it meant sacrificing everything and everyone. And my father had told me afterward that I'd wasted 4 years of expensive education. To state the obvious, I threw the book in a dumpster on my way to the subway, watched it land among the garbage bags and coffee cups, and felt something lift off my chest that I hadn't known was sitting there. On the train ride home, I called Luna and told her about the will, and she was quiet for a long moment before asking if I was okay, and I realized with some surprise that I actually was. The inheritance I'd been excluded from represented everything. I'd chosen to walk away from 32 years ago, the cold transactions that passed for relationships in my family, the constant performance of success, the misery disguised as accomplishment. Luna and I had dinner that night at our favorite Vietnamese restaurant, the one where the owner knew our names and always brought us extra spring rolls. And we talked about what we'd do with money we didn't have and didn't need. We'd pay off our student loans, maybe, or finally take that trip to her family's village in the Philippines. Or we could donate it all to the school where I taught and watch it actually make a difference in kids' lives, instead of sitting in some investment account growing interest. We laughed about the absurdity of it all, about my father leaving millions to children who already had millions while giving nothing to the one who could have actually used it. And somewhere between the pho and the Vietnamese coffee, I realized I'd been given an unexpected gift. The first email from Percival came 2 days later. A carefully worded message asking if we could meet for coffee to discuss the estate situation. And I deleted it without responding. Theodora called 3 times in one afternoon, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails about how the will wasn't fair and maybe there was some legal action I could take. And I didn't call her back either. They were worried, I realized. Worried that I was planning some kind of challenge to the will. Some legal battle that would tie up the estate and cost them all money in lawyer fees and bad publicity. I let them worry for a week before I sent a single group text that said simply, "Congratulations on your inheritance. I hope it brings you everything you deserve." I turned off my phone after that and spent the weekend with Luna hiking in the Catskills, breathing in clean air and sleeping in a tent and remembering what it felt like to want things that money couldn't buy. When I turned my phone back on, there were 17 missed calls and a dozen text messages, ranging from relieved to confused to almost angry. And I deleted all of them without reading past the first line. The revenge I'd been planning without knowing I was planning, it started to take shape in my mind during those quiet weeks after the will reading. It wasn't going to be dramatic or public or even particularly satisfying in the way that revenge is supposed to be satisfying in movies and books. It was going to be quiet and personal and completely devastating in a way that only I would fully appreciate. Because the best revenge against people who'd spent their whole lives measuring worth in dollar signs was to prove that their metric was meaningless. Threw myself into my teaching with a renewed energy that surprised even me. Staying late to help students who were struggling, writing letters of recommendation for college applications, organizing a poetry slam that brought the whole school together. One of my students, a kid named Marcus who'd been failing English for 2 years straight, wrote a poem about his mother working 3 jobs that made half the audience cry. And afterward he hugged me and said I was the first teacher who'd ever made him feel like his words mattered. I thought about my father sitting in his study, counting his money and his accolades. And I wondered if he'd ever felt anything close to what I felt in that moment. Luna started a program at her nonprofit to help undocumented families navigate the immigration system, working 18-hour days and coming home exhausted but glowing with the kind of purpose that made her beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with the designer clothes Theodora wore or the personal trainers she employed. We were broke and tired, and our apartment was too small, and our car made a weird rattling noise that we couldn't afford to fix. But we were building something real. Something that mattered. Something that would outlast us. 6 months after the will reading, I got a call from Percival's wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, as it turned out. Charlotte had found out about the affairs, plural, and she was taking him for everything she could get in the divorce. And she wanted me to know that she'd always liked me, even though Percy had forbidden her from associating with the family embarrassment. She told me things I hadn't known about how Percival drank himself to sleep most nights, about the antidepressants he took and hid from our father, about the time he'd told her he wished he'd had the courage to walk away like I did. I thought about calling him, about reaching out, but what would I say? That I was sorry he'd won the prize he'd been chasing his whole life and found out it was worthless. That trading your dreams for father's approval was a losing bargain, no matter how many millions came with it. Instead, I sent flowers to Charlotte with a note that said, "Congratulations on your freedom," and I meant it. Theodora's unraveling was more public and therefore more entertaining to the society pages that had always loved the Blackwood family drama. Her perfect marriage turned out to be a carefully maintained facade hiding Preston's gambling addiction and her own prescription pill problem. And when Preston's debts caught up with him, he emptied their joint accounts and disappeared to Monaco, leaving Theodora with 2 kids, a mortgage on a house she couldn't afford, and a reputation in tatters. The same people who'd attended her charity luncheons suddenly couldn't return her calls, and the invitations to gallery openings and benefit dinners dried up overnight. She showed up at my apartment on a Tuesday evening, standing in the hallway in yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt that I'd never seen her wear in public before. Her hair in a messy ponytail and her face free of the makeup she usually applied with surgical precision. "Can I come in?" she asked, and her voice was small in a way I'd never heard it, And despite everything, I stepped aside and let her enter. Luna made tea while Theodora sat on our second-hand couch and looked around our apartment with what I could only describe as wonder. Touching the books that lined every wall, examining the photographs of our life together that we'd hung in mismatched frames. "You were right," Theodora said finally, wrapping her hands around the mug of tea Luna had given her. "About all of it. About choosing something real instead of father's approval. About building a life that actually means something." She started crying then. Real tears this time, not the performative grief she'd displayed at the funeral. And she told me about how empty her life had been. How she'd wake up in her 6-bedroom house and feel absolutely nothing. How she'd realized she didn't even know who she was underneath all the roles she'd been playing. I wanted to feel triumphant. Wanted to revel in the schadenfreude of watching my siblings' lives fall apart while mine stayed intact. But instead I just felt sad. Sad for the years we'd all wasted trying to earn the love of a man who was incapable of giving it. Sad for the relationships we'd destroyed in pursuit of an inheritance that couldn't buy happiness or peace or meaning. "What are you going to do?" I asked Theodora, and she shrugged helplessly. This woman who'd always had a plan for everything, who'd organized her entire life with color-coded spreadsheets and 5-year projections. "I don't know," she admitted. "I thought about going back to school, maybe. I used to want to be a therapist, before father convinced me it was beneath our family's station." She laughed bitterly. 38 years old, and I'm finally admitting what I wanted to be when I grew up. I told her it wasn't too late. That I'd gone back to school at 30 to get my teaching certification. That Luna had completely changed careers at 30. And I watched something like hope flicker in her eyes. She asked if she could stay in touch. If maybe we could have coffee sometimes, or if her kids could meet their aunt and uncle. And I looked at Luna, who nodded slightly. "Yes," I said. "But on one condition. You leave the Blackwood bullshit at the door. No more pretending, no more performing. If we're going to build a relationship, it's going to be a real one." Theodora agreed. And over the following months she became someone I didn't recognize, someone softer and more genuine. Someone who laughed too loud and cried too easily, and was learning how to be human instead of perfect. Percival took longer to crack, clinging to the wreckage of his old life with the same determination he'd once applied to building it. He threw himself into work, took on more clients, made more money, bought a bigger apartment, dated women half his age who looked perfect on his arm, and never stayed longer than a few months. I heard about it all through the social circuit that still occasionally gossiped about the Blackwood family. Through mutual acquaintances who loved to share updates about how Percy was doing so well in a tone that suggested they knew he absolutely wasn't. The breaking point came on what would have been our father's 75th birthday, when Percival showed up at my school in the middle of the day, still in his suit from some meeting, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the 18 months since the will reading. The security guard called me down to the main office, and I found my brother sitting on the bench where we sent kids who were in trouble, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "I don't know how to do this," he said when he saw me. And I didn't have to ask what this meant, this being alive, this being himself, this existing outside the rigid framework our father had built for him. I took him to the coffee shop across the street from the school. The one where I graded papers and Luna met me for lunch. And we sat across from each other at a sticky table while teenagers laughed and flirted around us. Percival told me everything about the panic attacks that had started after Father's funeral. About the therapist he'd finally started seeing who was helping him understand that he'd spent 41 years trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it. About how he'd realized that every major decision he'd ever made had been about seeking approval he would never receive. "You always knew," Percival said, looking at me with something like envy. "Even when we were kids, you knew that his approval wasn't worth what it cost." "How did you know that?" I thought about the question. About 7-year-old me declaring my intention to be a teacher and seeing the light go out in my father's eyes. About the years of being dismissed and diminished and treated like a disappointment. "I didn't know," I said honestly. "I just knew that pretending to be someone else felt worse than being rejected for who I actually was." We talked for 3 hours. Until my planning period was over and I had to get back to class. And when we parted, Percival hugged me with a desperation that made my ribs ache. "Can I call you?" he asked. Not to talk about Father or the estate or any of that, just to talk. I gave him my number, the one he'd had for years but never used. And over the following months he became a stranger to me in the best possible way, someone I was meeting for the first time. Someone who was learning how to exist without a script. The final piece of my revenge came. Together on the 2nd anniversary of our father's death. When both Percival and Theodora asked if they could come to a dinner party Luna and I were hosting at our apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, just some friends from school and the neighborhood. Potluck style with mismatched dishes and cheap wine, but it was real in a way that Blackwood family gatherings had never been. I watched my siblings navigate this environment awkwardly at first. Theodora bringing expensive wine that she immediately apologized for when she saw everyone else had brought bottles from Trader Joe's. Percival overdressed in slacks and a button-down while everyone else wore jeans, but something happened as the evening wore on and the wine flowed and people started telling stories. Theodora laughed at one of Luna's terrible puns, an actual genuine laugh that transformed her entire face. And Percival got into a passionate discussion with one of my teacher friends about education reform. I watched them from across the room, these people who'd been strangers to me despite sharing DNA. And I realized they were finally becoming the siblings I'd always wanted. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had left and we were cleaning up, Theodora asked if I ever felt angry about the inheritance, about being excluded from Father's will. I thought about the question seriously, about the anger I'd carried for so long and the moment I'd let it go. "I used to," I said. But then I realized he actually did me a favor. He freed me from the obligation to grieve him as a good father. From the guilt of benefiting from his money. From any remaining illusion that his approval was something worth wanting. Percival, elbow deep in soapy water washing dishes, laughed a sharp, bitter sound. So his final act of cruelty was actually kindness. That's beautifully ironic. But I shook my head, because he still didn't quite understand. "It wasn't kindness," I said. He meant it as punishment, as one last way to tell me I'd failed him. But the joke's on him, because the punishment set me free. I pulled out my phone and showed them something. I'd been working on a scholarship fund Luna and I had established in my mother's name, funded entirely by our own savings and contributions from friends and former students. It wasn't much, just enough to send one kid from my school to college each year, but it was something real, something that would continue growing and helping people long after we were gone. "This is my inheritance," I said. "Not the money Father left you, but the choice he forced me to make when I was 7 years old. The choice to build something meaningful instead of profitable, to value people over portfolios, to measure success in lives touched instead of dollars accumulated." Theodora started crying again. She did that a lot now, as if making up for years of suppressed emotion. Percival set down the dish he was washing and stared at his hands. "I would trade every dollar of that inheritance," he said quietly, "to have had the courage to make that choice." I wanted to tell him it wasn't too late, that he could still change course, but I'd learned that people had to come to those realizations on their own, that to hit their own bottom before they could start climbing back up. The scholarship fund grew over the years, fed by contributions from former students who'd gone on to successful careers and wanted to pay it forward, by anonymous donors who believed in the mission, by small monthly payments from hundreds of people who'd never even met my mother but believed in what we were building. 5 years after my father's death, we'd sent 23 kids to college. Kids who would have otherwise never had the opportunity. Kids who were now becoming teachers and social workers and engineers and artists. Percival quit his job at the investment firm and went back to school to study marine biology at 46, taking a massive pay cut to work as a research assistant while he finished his degree. He sold his expensive apartment and moved into a modest 1-bedroom near the ocean. And the few times I visited him there, I saw a peace in his face that I'd never seen before. He was dating a marine biologist named Astrid, who talked passionately about whale migration patterns and didn't care that he no longer wore custom suits or drove a BMW. And when I met her, I understood that he'd finally figured out what I'd known all along, that love and respect couldn't be bought, only earned through authenticity. Theodora did go back to school, got her degree in social work, and started working at a nonprofit that helped women leaving abusive relationships. She moved to a smaller house in a less prestigious neighborhood, shared custody of her kids with Preston, who'd eventually returned from Monaco broke and humbled, and started dating a high school guidance counselor named Felix, who made her laugh until she snorted. The charity circuit she'd once dominated forgot about her, but the women she helped remembered her kindness, her empathy, her willingness to sit with them in their pain without judgment. The inheritance that had seemed so important, that had defined our family relationships for so long, turned out to be the least valuable thing our father left behind. Percival and Theodora had the money, invested wisely and growing steadily. But they'd both come to understand what I'd learned at 7. That wealth couldn't fill the void where love and purpose should be. Couldn't buy back the years they'd spent performing instead of living. Couldn't erase the damage done by chasing approval from someone incapable of giving it. My revenge, if you could even call it that, wasn't in taking anything from them or in their lives falling apart. It was in building a life so full of meaning and purpose and genuine connection that their inheritance became irrelevant by comparison. In proving through my own example that our father's value system was fundamentally broken. In showing them an alternative path they could choose if they had the courage. The greatest revenge against a man who measured worth in dollars was to build a life, rich in everything he'd never valued: love, community, purpose, authenticity, and to do it so visibly and joyfully that his children couldn't help but see what they'd been missing. 10 years after the will reading, on what would have been our father's 80th birthday, the three of us went together to visit our mother's grave. We brought flowers and stories and tears. And we stood there in the sunshine talking about the parent who'd actually loved us, who'd stayed up late helping with homework and attended every school play and somehow maintained her warmth despite being married to a man made of ice. We didn't visit our father's grave, hadn't since the funeral. And we didn't talk about him, except to acknowledge that his inability to love us had inadvertently taught us how important it was to love each other. Do you think he knew? Theodora asked, as we walked back to our cars. That cutting you out would eventually lead to all of this, to us actually becoming a family. I thought about my father, about his rigid worldview and his inability to imagine any path different from the one he'd chosen. No, I said. He thought he was punishing me, thought he was proving a point about the consequences of disappointing him. He never could have imagined that the punishment would set me free, and that my freedom would eventually free both of you. Percival laughed. That same bitter sound he'd made years ago in my apartment, but softer now, more forgiving. So in death, he finally brought us together, just not in the way he intended. I think that's the most perfectly Cornelius Blackwood thing I've ever heard. We stood in the parking lot. 3 people who shared DNA and a traumatic childhood and were slowly building something better together. And I felt a surge of gratitude for the father who'd rejected me, for the inheritance I'd never received, for every moment of pain and exclusion that had forced me to find my own path. The revenge was complete, but it didn't feel like revenge anymore. It felt like liberation, like proof that the best way to defeat someone who tried to define your worth was to define it yourself, on your own terms, using metrics that actually mattered. My father had tried to punish me by withholding his money and approval. But in doing so, he'd given me the greatest gift imaginable, the absolute certainty that I didn't need either one, and the freedom to build a life so authentically mine that no inheritance could ever match its value.